remember specifically, even as a teenager, being in my room, staring out the window, wondering out loud what in the world was wrong with me that I had to get beat every day. Like, what is wrong with me? I could feel something weird. I felt like a zipper on a jacket. I could feel my body and spirit unzipping. So I knew I was dying. I was streaming through the universe, beholding things of glory and infinitude and magnificence and just breathtaking. And I felt like it was so intense that if I hadn't been in some kind of a protective shield, I would have been incinerated in a heartbeat. Like, it was simply impossible to even look at that much glory and power, and unless you were protected. And so I felt like I was being fed with a fire hose. And that went on for, felt like a long time. Like, who knows what time means in those places, but it felt like a long time. And when we got back to the door, breathless, and, I realized 4 absolute fundamental truths. Number one,
this is Beyond with Heather Tesch, where we examine near-death experiences and life itself, hopefully making this life a little better. Hello, everybody. Welcome to my guest, Kellen Fluckiger. Hello, Kellen.
Hi, and you did it again. It's Fluckiger. And I love you for doing it, and don't apologize. It's okay. Everybody does it. Fluckiger. But thank you, Heather. I'm delighted to be here.
It's kind of a fluke that I said that, isn't it?
It is a fluke.
Yeah. Kellen, we met at the IANS conference. I watched you actually because you were one of the presenters, and I felt so motivated by what you shared with us. You had, I'm not sure if it would be considered 1 near-death experience or maybe 3 near-death experiences. And that's one of the things that I want to talk about. But also, I want you to share this incredible spiritually transformative experience you had years before that. And at the time, you were an addict, and that changed your life, and it really changed the trajectory of your life as well. And now you are out there coaching and helping so many people.
So I guess the first one would be classified as an OBE, an out-of-body experience. Yes. It was just a weird, incredible divine intervention. So the setup was this. I'm 52. It's August of 2007. I was raised in a very disciplined religious home, and the discipline today would be felony child abuse, and I would have been removed from the home. A lot of physical stuff, emotional, a little bit of sexual, but some very serious abuse. And it left me believing with all my heart that I wasn't good enough, and I never would be, and nothing I ever did, that kind of story. And that's funny because I was blessed with brains. I got good grades. I got a scholarship to go to college. But I spent my whole life trying to prove something to my mom, particularly because she was the wielder of discipline. And I love her to pieces. And she was too young to get married and, didn't know how to raise kids and whatever. So I don't think she ever woke up thinking, I'm going to be a jerk today, But it did affect me in profound and deep ways. And so what happened between when I left home at 17 until this experience at 52, that 35 years, I rode a roller coaster of creating big career success and then trashing it. I felt like I didn't deserve it. So I'd build success and then I'd burn it down. And I did that with relationships also. So I got married 3 times and ruined the relationships. I mean, obviously it takes 2 to tango, but I look at my behavior and say, okay, I did most of the tangoing. So And so in August of 2007, as we set up for this, I was single again for the 3rd time. I had built another big career, the 3rd or the 4th. I had 4 of my 10 children living with me, and 3 were grown up and married, and 3 were with, it's embarrassing to say it, but one of the exes. And I was a $3,000 a week cocaine addict. I was making so much money that didn't matter. I was, a really high functioning, blah, blah, blah. And I came home, life was a wreck. Life was an absolute wreck. My house was the party house. I had 4 teenagers and they brought all the friends over and I was useless. And so it was just a disaster. Anyway, I came home on a Friday night, getting ready to go out party for the weekend. And for some reason, suddenly I had the urge to turn on the television, which doesn't sound like anything, except I didn't watch TV. So I picked up the remote and I'd bought the biggest, coolest, plasma then you could buy, blah, blah, blah. And I picked up the remote and I'm like, ooh, I didn't know how to turn it on. So I had to ask one of my kids, my 16-year-old daughter, she punched the buttons, threw it at me, dipweed, and it landed on a program I'd never heard of because I didn't watch TV. It was a reality TV show called Intervention. Now, if you know that, you know what it is. And if you don't, it was a reality TV show where families staged professional interventions with counselors or priests or whoever with a busted loved one. And the protagonist in this particular episode was a high-ranking executive with a cocaine problem. So I watched my life for about 10 minutes and I said, yeah, I'm not watching this crap. So I turned it off and did some other things. And as I was ready to leave, I just felt absolutely compelled to turn on the TV again. So this time I knew how. And that program started over, which, I didn't have a recording device and it wasn't on the schedule. And of course, no, it can't do that, but it did. So it freaked me out, like right at the beginning. And I'm like, it freaked me out. So I sat down and watched it and it went badly. The guy got mad at his family and swore he didn't have a problem and stomped out of the room and, And so what happened is it just sort of freaked me out. So instead of going out to party, I went to bed. And when I went to bed, I went to hell. And what I mean by that is I went somewhere. It felt very much out of body. I was in a theater type room and there was scenes playing out on the stage. And the scenes were all focused. There were scenes from my life, not like a life review, but just stuff from my life. And every scene was focused on suffering. The suffering that had been inflicted on me as a child and the suffering I had inflicted on everybody else as a drug addict and a liar and a lousy partner and pathological liar, just the whole thing. And the level of emotional intensity was beyond description. I have no words to describe how I was experiencing that. And it went on for a long, long time. And after a long time, I heard a voice right here behind a little bit to the left, very clearly simply said, "It is enough." I woke up and I was completely disoriented for three reasons. One, I was upside down and backwards in bed. And number two, the bed sheets were completely soaked, like soaked, wring out soaked. And I couldn't imagine what in the world would produce that much liquid. The only thing I can make up is the intensity of the experience had caused me to sweat to that degree, which would have been impossible. Anyway, the real thing was the sun was shining in the window and the windows faced west. And I got up and looked at the clock and it was 5 o'clock Saturday afternoon. So I'd been somewhere for 18 hours. And I realized that I'd been invited to change. I didn't have any idea what to do, where to go, who to talk to, how to do this. I'd never really gotten any help with either my mental problems or hadn't even admitted those. I didn't understand any of it or the drugs or anything else. But I knew one thing. I'm done. I'm done. And so I threw away $1,000 worth of drugs I had laying around because I always did. And I quit cold turkey that day. And that was the first thing. And I knew I had to change my whole life, but I had absolutely no clue how to do it. So I went back to work Monday. I didn't have a job. I was a high-powered consultant and all that kind of stuff. And because of the position that I had, I used to get free stuff. Free tickets to expensive concerts, hockey seats, box seats on the floor, and, expensive bottles of booze, like I needed that. But that kind of stuff, not as bribes, but as, be nice to Kellen stuff. Because I made decisions that affected companies sometimes to the tune of billions of dollars. And so, people wanted to be nice to me. And one of the things I got was a pair of tickets to a Yo-Yo Ma concert. Now, if you know classical music, you know who that is. And if you don't, you don't. But in the classical realm, that's like, he's like, he's a cellist, but he's magnetic and whatever. So anyway, I was really excited. And I thought, wow, I'm going to love this. And I don't want to waste this other ticket, but I didn't have anybody to take, no. And so I asked in the groups that I managed, who likes classical music. And a woman in one of the groups said, well, I do. And I said, have I ever given you anything before? And she said, no. I said, okay, fine. Here you go. We'll see you there. And so two or 3 weeks later, 2.5 weeks, I guess, because it was midweek. We met at the concert, and now I'm 2.5 weeks stone cold sober, right? And the concert was amazing. And about halfway through, I had this feeling come over me that I recognized from a couple of weeks before. And this voice said to me, "You need to marry this woman." And I said, "You're insane." Because number one, I've screwed up 3 relationships. I don't know how to do this. I'm exactly 2.5 weeks sober. This is nuts. No. So later that night, we were backstage, and the tickets were like $1,000 tickets because they were backstage passes and tickets to the reception and, all this cool stuff. And so we're backstage, and then the voice came back and said, "Yeah, comma, and you need to tell her tonight." And then I went crazy because I thought, there's a couple of problems with this. First of all, I actually don't know her well enough to know if she's in a relationship. Like, I don't know that. And the second thing is, like, she could call the cops and have me arrested or something for harassment or whatever. So no, we're not doing that. And you don't win those arguments. So I did, and it went about like you would have expected. She thought I was insane, and she left. The 2 good things were she wasn't in a relationship, which I didn't know. And number 2, she didn't call HR, the cops, or do anything. And over the next 2 or 3 weeks, she had her own set of experiences, which led her and me 2 or 3 weeks later. I resigned from millions of dollars of contracts. She walked away from her entire career. We walked off into the sunset together, and we just celebrated last month our 17th wedding anniversary. And that's an amazing story, but that isn't even the most amazing part. Number 1, her name is Joy. And number 2, she was literally the angel that was sent to help me learn how to be a person, to have a friend, to be a friend, to tell the truth, and she has been invincible. She helped me find counselors and get healthy and just magic. And that was the other piece of this divine intervention, because I didn't have any support from family. I was alone. And so this was the angel I got sent to give me direction. Like, none of those things did the work. I had to show up at Shrink and do the work and change and crawl over broken glass and do whatever it is to get healed and stay sober and stuff. But that was the divine intervention that happened in August, September, October-ish of 2007.
It's an incredible story, and it has such a beautiful ending. But I know people are going to want to hear a little bit more about this hellish experience that you had. Do you think that was hell of your own making, or do you think you actually were in a place that is hell?
So I don't know if hell is a place with fire and hot coals and flames floating around. What I think, in my own experience, including that, is the greatest torture that we can experience isn't physical. It is the emotional and spiritual anguish for things that we have or haven't done. The desperate yearning that we could somehow fix, especially stupid or cruel or unkind things that we've done, and completely lacking the power to do it. And so I felt out of body and in a place. The seats weren't on fire, so that was not an accompaniment. But the witness of the anguish that I suffered as a child wasn't anger toward my mother or dad, but mostly mom. It was simply reliving the anguish of a child not understanding. Like, I remember, I don't remember if I thought this at the time, but I remember specifically, even as a teenager, being in my room, staring out the window, wondering out loud what in the world was wrong with me that I had to get beat every day. Like, what is wrong with me? And living in that just torture of like, what did I do? What am I? How do I, that kind of thing. And so it was a mixture of that. And then when it became things that I had done or not done in my own relationships and as a dad and a partner, that was just anguish of my one, stupidity and total inability to fix anything, like to re-witness and to understand was the greatest of spiritual, it was a spiritual anguish that had physical manifestations. So physical manifestations were obviously some great deal of anguish in the body that caused the liquid, and just the feeling of utter and absolute remorse. And it is of the degree that later, when I think about kids and stuff like that, it was that remorse of being a failure that had led me to the 2 suicide attempts I had made before that day. I mean, that day happened literally 2 weeks after my second suicide attempt.
I want to talk more too coming up about forgiveness, both toward yourself and others, but some of that you learned during your near-death experience.
Mm-hmm.
So you certainly had changed after this experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 2018, you were traveling, you got sick, and you ended up in the hospital where you had, like I said, I'm not sure if it's 1 near-death experience or 3, but can you tell us what happened to you?
Yeah. So let me just bridge the gap. 11 years later, so that was 2007, 2018. What I did for those 11 years, the first 3 or 4 were spent, well, 2 or 3 years probably, were spent really intensely working on myself, going to see shrinks, getting sober and healthy and doing the things that I needed to. And that included examining myself and starting the beginnings of learning forgiveness and that sort of stuff toward myself and toward others. And in that process, then I started thinking, well, all this stuff that I'm learning can be of service to others. So, I better use that. And that's where the desire to be a coach was born. And I also started writing. So I started writing books then and created a coaching practice. So that I'd been working on for 8 of the 11 years between 2007 and 2018. And it was going well. I built a coaching practice and had written several books and stuff by 2018. Now, as you mentioned, in 2018, things were going well. We went on a cruise. I got sick and came home and ended up in the hospital. And I wrote all the details of it in the book, Meeting God at the Door. But anyway, I flatlined. They put me first in, they told me they were going to put me in the ICU. And then they said, we're going to put you in biological isolation. And if you don't know what that is, think of, biohazard 4 hazmat suits and double doors and blah, blah, blah. And then they came in with the question and said, do we have permission to intubate you and do anything we need to do to preserve your life? And I'm like, what? And so I said, yeah, okay. And then I went into meditation because one of the things I'd learned to do was meditate well, and I was good at it. In the meditation process, I could feel something weird. I felt like a zipper on a jacket. I could feel my body and spirit unzipping. So I knew I was dying. And I just experienced that. And then somewhere later, I flatlined. So they moved me to the ICU and in a thing, and I saw a picture of me, and I'm restrained, strapped to a stretcher full of everything you ever saw in any hospital movie, right? That was me. And during the flatline, I had an experience. So the reason you're saying 3 is I had 3 conversations with God at the door between life and eternity. So when I flatlined, I came to spiritually, and I sat up because I was laying down. I sat up, and the room had changed. I wasn't looking at people and doctors and things. It was sort of gray, like a photo card gray, foggy a little. And over my left shoulder, there was a doorway. And I looked over there, and I don't know why, but I wanted to be at the door. So suddenly I'm standing at the door, and I'm leaning on the door jamb on my right shoulder. And there wasn't a door in it. It was just a doorway. And on the other side, there was somebody leaning on that door jamb on their right shoulder, and they were, close enough to touch. And we stood there for a minute, and then he looked at me and he said, do you want to come home? And I knew, in the way you only know things in that spiritual realm, who I was talking to, what the door was, what the question was. And it was interesting because there was no expectation of what the answer was going to be. I knew absolutely there was going to be an answer. Like, you're not going to not answer, but you can do whatever you want. So we talked about it for a while, and I said what I've been doing in these 11 years since the last miraculous thing, and what I was trying to do, and what my plans were, and et cetera, et cetera. And I talked about Joy, my wife, and just everything about it. And finally, I said, I'm not done. And he said, okay. And that was the end of the first conversation. And I'm quite sure that's when they were able to restart my heart. The second and third conversations happened on the next 2 days. And I was in a coma for 17 more days. So I was out to the world, and people always ask, how did you know it was the next day? And the answer is, I have no idea. It was the next day. Okay. So I don't know. I'm standing back at the door, same situation, standing there talking to the same person. And the question of the previous day didn't come up. Said, okay, you're going to stay. So what are you going to do? And so I started talking about the work I was doing, and which is mostly, I'm a business coach. I was C-suite exec in the US and Canada, big shot, this, that, and the other. So I'm really good at that. But what I've discovered is the biggest barriers are not in understanding how to create and market products and services. They're in what we believe we can do, the mindset work. And so that's really where all the work is. So anyway, so we talked about that, my coaching practice and what I wanted to do and how I was trying to add good to the world based on everything I'd learned from my own experience. And then I had an experience that I can't describe. I can give you an analogy. There's an old movie made in the 90s that Jodie Foster was in called Contact. If you've seen that movie, it's about aliens that beam instructions down to Earth to build a weird space thing. And she gets in it and she takes off on a journey through the universe. If you've seen the movie, you know what I mean. And if you haven't, you haven't. It's okay. Go watch it. It's fun. But anyway, I had an experience that's the best analogy of it was. I was streaming through the universe, beholding things of glory and infinitude and magnificence and just breathtaking. And I felt like it was so intense that if I hadn't been in some kind of a protective shield, I would have been incinerated in a heartbeat. Like it was simply impossible to even look at that much glory and power, and unless you were protected. And so I felt like I was being fed with a fire hose, and that went on for felt like a long time. Like who knows what time means in those places, but it felt like a long time. And when we got back to the door, breathless and, I realized 4 absolute fundamental truths. Number one, each of us are divine, intentional, lovingly created beings. We are literally the divine offspring of God, period. Like whatever your genealogy is, parents, grandparents, the pedigree of your spirit's on a single line. End. That I know. All right. The second thing is that we all had a mission and purpose that we not only agreed to, but we were excited about. Like we were stoked to do this work when we came here. The third thing is that we were given the gifts and talents that we need to both enjoy and to do that thing. And the fourth one is all the help we need is available from both sides of that door. So I thought about that. And I finally said, well, since that's true, why do we settle for crumbs? And I don't know if in the economy of heaven, brevity is a virtue, but the answer was 4 words. Because you don't believe. And I'm like, I didn't facepalm. I thought about it. Okay. And I said, okay, duh. So what can I do about that? Like, how can I help? And he said, literally, glad you asked. And so then what came then was a framework that I wrote in that second book, the book of Context, which is a process about how to identify and change beliefs that we have that are as deep as our DNA. How do you, they don't, we weren't created with those. We learned them. So it's a process to unlearn and create new beliefs. And it was magnificent. And so I wrote it in a second book because it was big, and it also was sort of off topic from the visits themselves. I mean, it was a great piece, but it wasn't anyway. So that was it, and that felt like a really long visit. I have no way of knowing what that means because, like I said, I was in a coma for 17 days. But whatever. The third visit, and then it ended. And on the day of the third visit, I was excited. I was bouncing like somebody on one of those desk balls, ding, 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 ding. I was excited, and I was repeating all the pieces that I'd learned of the context framework and everything. And so I came back to the door, and there we were. And he looked at me and asked one question. He said, "Are you sure?" And I felt like I was hyperventilating. I felt like, what do you mean, am I sure? Am I stupid? Am I biting off more than I can chew? Like what? Am I sure? Am I missing something? Right? That's kind of what I felt like. And so we talked about each one of those from every way I could think of. And finally, we got done. It was clear that I would have the support and help that I needed. And no, I was not imagining, all that stuff. And so finally I said, yes, I'm sure. And that was the end. And nothing was said, but that last conversation ended with a finality that I knew we were done. And so then I was in a coma for, another couple of weeks. And before I came to consciousness again, and the disease that I had completely ravaged my body. I had necrotizing MRSA, which is MRSA, which is a superbug in both lungs and in my bloodstream. It completely trashed my lungs. The head of the infectious disease department at the university, it's the university hospital, told me that the 10-day kill rate of what I had was 100%. And so, yeah, of course you died. Duh. Like you can't not die. And so it was a miracle that I was alive, and it was by choice. And that's what I had, and it ravaged, just literally destroyed my lungs. And I lost 35 pounds. I couldn't walk. I looked like a concentration camp survivor. And I've seen a picture of that, and it's, that, right? And so that was it. And I gradually, a month later, I get out of the hospital. That discharge was a miracle. And we don't have time for that one, but that's in the books. And then gradually learned to walk again. And it's a month. I could finally walk to the end of the block and, all of that stuff. And now my lungs 6.5 years later, are maybe back at 80 or 90%. They told me when I left, it would be 2 years to never to get my lungs back. And so far we're still in the never zone, but I still have short of breath and I'm on inhaled corticosteroids, which I'll probably be on forever. But anyway, so that's the experience that happened. And one little addendum in October, 3 or 4 months later, I was healed enough that by then I'd written the 2 books, Meeting God at the Door and the Book of Context. And I had 4 appointments to go speak at different events. And I did. And when I spoke at one of them, a lady asked me, it was time for Q&A. She said, what's the most important thing that's happened to you because of that? And I hadn't really prepared for any questions, so I was thinking about it. And while I did, I heard my mouth open and say, I no longer experience fear. And so then that gave me a chance to think about that. And that's one of the real true things. Like the way I experience life is completely different than I used to. And so that's it. There it is. That's the end of the experience.
I read your book, Meeting God at the Door, and loved it. So much wisdom and inspiration, and you really heard a lot from God. And I want to talk more about that, but we're going to go ahead and take that into part 2. And I encourage everybody, you need to stick around because there's some really good stuff coming. So fantastic to talk to Kellen. And in part 2, I hope you'll walk away from that the same way I did. I'm like, wow, I just learned so much. I mean, he talks about his conversation with God, more on that. He also talks about what it's like to be in the presence of God, but he also has this great advice, things that he learned that he shares. And I went, wow, I mean, that makes so much sense. Here's just a little taste of what we cover.
So judgment and, hellfire and brimstone and all the stuff that we hear. What I noticed that was so remarkable was the absence of any of that. The other thing is just awe. The being who is in charge of that vast stuff that I saw and experienced would know my name. He wants us to love ourselves completely. I think he wants us to learn to appreciate us like he does. I think he wants us to learn to see ourselves through his eyes as an infinite pile of potential that are just the right choices away from developing that and being that light. I mean, I'm a coach and I have clients all over the world, and I'm a pretty straight up, what you see is what you get coach, like you would be with an Olympian or a senior executive that's running $1 billion company. You don't fool around. So I have several little things that I call them billion-dollar secrets. And one of them is this.
Part 2 is really worth your time. I know not everybody comes back for it, but certainly worth it. I will have a link or the release date that is always in the description. You can find it there. You can find a link to all of Kellan's contact information and his books, that sort of thing. And then also, of course, a link to all of my other episodes. So you can always find something to watch there. But I'd love to know now your thoughts on this episode. Kellan talked about this hellish experience, but boy, what a life changer. And then he had this near-death experience and these conversations. So what stood out the most to you? What really made you go, wow? Or was there something that you learned that you took away from it? I'd love to know that. If you prefer just to say, I made it, meaning you made it to the end of my podcast, you can do that as well. I always appreciate that. Or any other thoughts that you have that you want to share. Those comments do mean a lot. They help the channel, but also I love connecting with you. And if you're a regular viewer, you know that I do read those comments, and I do try to get back to as many of you as I can. Sometimes it's taken me a few weeks because maybe I had something going on in life and I couldn't do it right away, but I really try to get back fairly soon. But even if it takes me a while, I usually reply. So you can always go back and look at your comments and see what I had to say. So thank you for all of you that do take the time to do that. I also appreciate your likes. I appreciate you subscribing. And as you always know, I just appreciate you being here. So many of you are so loyal, and you come back week after week and you write these beautiful comments. And I'm just so grateful for all of you. And welcome to all of you that are new as well. I hope you'll come back. And a good place to come back to is part 2. So I hope I'll see you all there. Take care. Thanks for joining me on Beyond with Heather Tesch. Please add comments and questions you'd like future guests to answer. Also, if you liked what you heard, please hit the thumbs up button and subscribe. That'll help keep this podcast going. You can also go to Beyond with Heather Tesch to look for more episodes.